Good morning, folks. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jimmy Bashara with ISO Stakeholder Affairs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest Energy Storage and Distributed Energy Resources Phase 4 Stakeholder Call. At this time, I'd like to introduce my colleagues in the room with me here today, beginning to my left.
Hi, everybody. This is Dave Murtaugh from Policy.
Hi, this is Greg Ford from IT.
Lauren Carr from Policy.
Eric Kim with Policy.
Jill Powers with Policy.
And Bill Weaver from Legal.
Thanks, folks. Our agenda for today, as you can see, we'll discuss the latest revised straw proposal, which we feel has made great strides since the last iteration, thanks largely in part, of course, to the stakeholder input and participation that we have received to date. After laying out our stakeholder process and objectives, we'll begin discussing the topics contained within this last iteration, starting with the end-of-hour state of charge topic, the market power mitigation for storage resources, and then following our lunch break, we'll pick up with the variable output demand response topic, the parameters to reflect demand response operational characteristics, and then finally a discussion on the non-24/7 settlement topic, followed by next steps. Of course, as you may know, this is a simple display of our stakeholder process in which we obtain stakeholder input in between each proposal iteration, consisting of a series of meetings and calls, after which we would carry the final proposal to our Board of Governors for consideration for approval. Also, as you may know, our calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings, and of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. And lastly, of course, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand by pushing #2 to enter the queue. And then once you're in the queue, we will be sure to call on you. And for everyone, of course, we ask that you please state the name and the company that you represent. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Eric.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Good morning, everyone. I just want to thank you all for joining us on this call. I know that we're going to be doing this over the phone over the for the entire day, so I just appreciate those who will be sticking through. I think this is a new approach. We'll, in the future try to work towards more interactive features in our calls, but this also hopefully just saves in terms of travel time for some of our stakeholders. But anyways, this is going to be an all day, and I just do want to preface this with that although it is from 10 to 3, we do have a lunch break in the middle, and so we may be running a little bit short on time. So we're going to try and stick pretty close to the schedule. So that means that some discussions or questions go a little bit further. We may have to just hold that off after some time, and then we could, either have an offline call on that, or, you could also express some of those questions on your comments, and we'll make sure to respond to that. So on our scope here, as you've already read through the paper, we have really 6 items that we've listed out, but it's actually going to be dropping to 5, and that's really because our consideration of the non-24/7 settlement of behind-the-meter resources is something that we are not considering under ESDR 4 at this time. We will go into more of the details of why we think so, why the ESDR 4 process, at least in this timeline, may not make sense, because we think there's a lot of jurisdictional question marks. But again, we'll go into those details, but really, these other 5 will be going in, the numbers 1 and 2, and then 4 and 5 will be going into much more detail on this call. One other thing I do want to just let everyone know, it's not formally presented on these slides or all, but just logistically what we're thinking with ESDR 4 as we're approaching the end of this year is that this is really our last take at ESDR 4 before the end of the year. Really what we're hoping to do is spend a lot more time with interaction with stakeholders, whether there's one more time before the end of the year and then several other times, whether it's through calls like this or maybe an in-person meeting early next year in 2020. And then we'll come out with another iteration of the proposal. So just want to give everyone a heads up in terms of any more written proposals. This will be kind of the last take at it for 2019. And we'll go into a little bit more detail with maybe some additional materials under our variable output DR that we may want to release at the end of the year. So with that, we'll go straight into our end of our SSE proposal. Okay, so the end of our SOC proposal, we've been very consistent with what we are proposing. The last time we actually had one of our stakeholders come up, WPTF, to come up and gave a presentation on the option to create sort of a range, a minimum and maximum range in this end of our SOC proposal. We thought that was a great idea and appreciate all the stakeholder support as well as your comments to that. So our end of our SOC would still be a bid parameter, but now it could be submitted as a range from a minimum to maximum. So as you can see in the figure here, the range is shown as 30 megawatt hours to 40 megawatt hours, and that would be something that would be biddable, and the market would consider where at the end of the hour that state of charge is going to land between those max. Now, if the scheduling coordinator just wants a single SOC state, single SOC, they would put the min and max to equal at, for example, 40 megawatt hours. On the next slide and the next two slides, we kind of just go over these graphical representations that we have in the paper with the different constraints. And generally, just what we're trying to illustrate here is that depending on what is the most limiting constraint, the market is going to take that into priority. So, for example, our upper and lower charge limits, these are the bounds that you would that the scheduling coordinator can represent for their resource. If the end of our SOC that we're proposing here ever goes into that kind of forbidden area, it actually would never be able to go into that area because of these upper and lower charge limits. So again, you can see here by the percentage that the upper charge limit is capped at 80% and the lower charge limit is capped at 20%. The end of hour maximum was put in at maybe, at 90% or 40%. It is okay in the end of our minimum at 40%, but if it ever goes above the upper charge limit at 80%, you'll see in that in those red bars that the market will never dispatch the resource to go up to that area, to that bound. We have 2 questions? Okay, I will stop there and we'll take the questions.
Moving to our first question. Your line's muted. Please go ahead.
Good morning. This is Albus Svoboda over at PG&E. How are you?
Hi, Albus.
Just 2 points. One point I wanted sort of more on the structure. I wanted to suggest that as you move from one item to the next, you provide some form of parking lot or sense of what you think your sense of the open issues are, just to make this a little bit more systematic than it's been in the past, where we've kind of, I know you basically feel the need at some point to close off, questions being asked, and there are people who still have questions, but it'd be good to have some closure on each, even if you just take a couple minutes to say what you think are the open items, then other people can comment if they think there are other items, but just a suggestion. The other case I wanted you to consider in terms of the slide you're looking at is what happens if you're outside of the limits, because this is remembering that your real-time state of charge is based on telemetry. Be curious to see how you could say your telemetry could be outside of your upper and lower charge limits, and as well outside of your SOC limits. How you're thinking of handling that situation? Thank you.
Thanks, Alva.
Hi, this is Greg. I mean, that can, if for some reason, I mean, there's 2 things that could happen. One is that even if the resource is following the dispatch instructions, it may be impossible to get to the upper and lower charge limits at the end of the hour. The optimization will do its best to try and meet the limitations, but we can't always guarantee it.
Okay, so you'll just...
always good.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Alva.
Sorry, you'll just drive it at its maximum rate to try to get it to within the limits, essentially.
Pretty much, yeah. And then the same thing if the resource is not following its dispatch instructions, the same thing will happen. or, you know, starts up very close, but we're just never able to get there because it's not following the instructions. And that's
Right.
Yeah,
Okay,
there would be a series, there would be some type of software or soft constraints to make sure that we get a
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, we'll take the next question. And it's noted, Alva, just real quick, Alva, just that, you know, if there's any open issues that stakeholders do bring up on these calls, I'm not saying we're not going to address it. We'll try our best, but if we do run close to that time, scheduled time, then we will have to just, you know, put it in, place on hold, and we'll make sure to address it.
Moving to the next question. Your lines are muted. Please go ahead.
Oh, hey, Eric. Steve Greenleaf, Customized Energy Solutions. Real quick process question. I don't think you touched on it. I thought I heard John last week at the Market Performance Planning Forum say that kind of the end date for ESDR 4 has been pushed to the third quarter of next year. So I was just wondering if you could confirm that and talk about maybe why, and then also what your thinking is at this point as far as implementation goes.
Yeah. So John is correct with what he announced at the Market Performance and Planning Forum. So ESDR was still always on track for a 2021 implementation timeline. That's been kind of what we've been working with. As you know, ESDR 3, our previous phase was split into two, meaning that 3B, so the second of ESDR 3, the second piece of ESDR 3 is going in fall of 2020. So by following that, ESDR 4 was really looking at a 2021 implementation, meaning that we had a little bit more time, and that, you know, that meant that we were going to, you know, work with stakeholders a lot more, develop a proposal, and not have to go as early as we thought, as we had planned for, to the board. And so a Q3 board date is something that we're shooting for, we're targeting for. I think also just because of the development of some of our, you know, our default energy bid for energy storage is very complex, as you're going to see later on. So we do need some more time with that. In addition to that, you know, we'll be doing some more kind of internally, we'll be developing things like the tariff language as well as kind of specifications for our technology team for implementation before we go to the board for ESDR. So we're kind of we're extending it for good reason, because we want to develop the proposal a lot. You know, we want to continue to develop the proposal, and we have several kind of internal documents that we want to prepare before we go to the board.
Okay, that's helpful, I think. And if I recall correctly, I think the storage as a transmission asset was somewhat dependent on the completion of at least the policy phase for ESDR 4. And so is that likely also to be extended? You may have outlined that in the policy roadmap. I can't recall, but do you know if that's been deferred as well?
Yeah, I would say you'd want to refer to the policy roadmap on that, but I would also say because ESDR's implementation timeline hasn't been extended, it's still for a 2021 implementation. I would say any timelines associated with the storage as transmission asset wouldn't be affected. We're merely just kind of, you know, working within the timeline of, you know, our policy development phase, but that hasn't changed our implementation timeline.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for the question. Okay. All right. I think there's no more questions, so we will go into our ancillary service awards. But I appreciate the questions on the timelines. I think we should have paused there and you know, to see if there were any other comments or questions. But let's go into our second constraint with ancillary service awards. So here, the point here is that the market will maintain the state of charge to meet AS awards, and that is going to take a higher priority than the end of our SOC. And it's more in the sense that if the AS award requires that the state of charge needs to be more in order to meet that ancillary service award, then the market is going to make sure that the resource is fully charged and ready to meet that. And so that is what we're That is what we're trying to show here in the end of our minimum at 40%, but really because of the AS award, it requires a 50% state of charge, and so that's what the figure here is trying to show. Okay, let's move on to our bid cost recovery. So under bid cost recovery, as just wanted to provide a little more context to stakeholders. In earlier iterations, we kind of looked at various options. We actually looked at 2 options to determine when bid cost recovery would apply. But really, through the development of this, we've also heard this from some of our stakeholders, as well as just kind of internally, we've been looking at scenarios, trying to look for, intervals or times of which when the SOC was actually, the end of our SOC parameter would, not spark a BCR was something that was very complicated, and actually we came to the conclusion that the end of our SOC does affect how our market optimizes and dispatches these resources. And because it's an option for resources to use, to really have a, again, an end of our state of charge, the CAISO doesn't believe that bid cost recovery or, bid costs should be recovered during these times. So really our proposal here is not looking at any options, but really just saying during the hour of when an SOC, an end of our SOC bid has been submitted, there will be no bid cost recovery for that resource. Additionally, another thing that we did realize through this process and early on was that an end of our SOC is a market function that we do want to introduce through ESRA 4, but we do see that resources are able to provide, have some sort of certainty today through a self-schedule. And so we do want to make sure and clarify that self-schedules, through ESRA 4, we do want to propose and make sure our tariff changes are in effect with this, as well as our bid cost recovery rules, that any resource, any non-generated resource, any energy storage resources that are self-scheduling will also not be eligible for bid cost recovery. And this is going to be affecting resources that are that have a schedule, that have a self-schedule, but in the preceding hour leading up to that self-schedule, during those intervals, bid cost recovery would not apply. And that's really because the market needs to make sure that the resource is ready to meet its self-schedule, and so it is doing its optimization, it's basing its optimization on trying to meet that self-schedule in the next hour. So I want to pause there because that is our end of our SOC proposal, and take questions and comments.
Moving to the first question, your line's unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Alva. 2 questions. One, what are the state of charge requirements that you anticipate having for reg up, reg down, and spin day? So you receive a day-ahead award in one or all of those 3 products. What are the state of charge constraints that will apply? Can you define those?
Yeah, hi Alva, this is Greg. I'm not sure this is exactly the numbers, but basically you'd have to have enough charge to be able to perform, I think per our tariff or BPM, so something like regulation, I think it's like a 30-minute requirement for the reg up you would have. Similarly, I think it's required for reg down, and then spin and non-spin would be, or spin and non-spin 30 minutes, and then reg is an hour. But anyway, it's the same kind of numbers. Whatever those translate to into continuous performance across an hour or perhaps 30 minutes is what we're looking at there.
I think that's a good comment as well and question. We'll make sure to put those requirements in our next iteration as well.
That would be great. That'd be great. The other question I had was on the bid cost recovery. My understanding of this right now would be that, especially because you don't have state of charge control in the day-ahead market at the end of the day from your paper. Suppose you get a schedule out of day ahead, and there's an implied state of charge trajectory there. You're not going to lose your day-ahead bid cost recovery by controlling real time so as to be able to deliver your day-ahead awards. Am I correct? I mean, obviously, if you did it in such a way that you can't meet your day-ahead awards, you might lose your bid cost recovery and your revenues from the day ahead. But if you were simply to constrain your schedule either with state of charge or self-schedule or a combination of the two to preserve your day-ahead awards, you would not lose your day-ahead bid cost recovery. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, that's correct.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's another good point too. That Greg's pointing out that we'll make sure to include that. I think that's a great point that we need to clarify as we state these bid cost recovery rules.
Yeah, hey Alva, this is Gabe. I just wanted to add a little bit onto that. I think we should be a little bit careful. Part of the reasons why we're saying that resources who are using these data charge parameters in the real-time market won't be eligible for bid cost recovery is they can effectively undo whatever schedules have been made in the day-ahead markets. So I think we need to be very careful in thinking through that before we, and know the implications of deciding one way or the other. Does that make sense?
Okay.
I was muted there. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's just the muting and unmuting process. Yeah, that's very helpful, Gabe. And I don't know what all the use cases are, but I agree it might be more subtle. I just wanted to raise the issue. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's worth raising. We appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay. Do we have another comment or a question? All right, so let's move on. And I'm going to hand this over to Gabe on our end of JSC proposal.
Well, yeah, and I think a proposal might be a bit of a strong word there. So Alva, I think you've already alluded to this, but we've received comments from some stakeholders suggesting that we may potentially want to implement an end-of-day state of charge parameter. I think currently the ISO is in a position where we'd like to understand a little bit better about why this might be needed and how it could be accommodated in our markets. But essentially, I wanted to go over some background, and I don't have a whole lot of material on this, but I did want to talk about it a little bit. So first of all, I think there's been some misunderstandings about what our day-ahead market does do and what it doesn't do. So essentially, when you bid in a storage resource, you're bidding in, a bid to charge the resource at the low end of the bid curve. You're bidding in a portion of the bid curve to discharge the resource at the high end of the bid curve. And then you also implicitly, between those two, have a spread as well. So perhaps a resource could bid into the market at $20 to charge the storage resource and $50 to discharge the storage resource, which implies a $30 spread between charging and discharging. Obviously, both portions of the charge curve and discharge curve could be sloped, which could make that spread bidding more complicated, but the very simple example is just two bids. One bid for everything below zero at $20, one bid for everything above $0 at $50, or 0 megawatts at $50, and you get that $30 spread that's implied there. So and then in addition to that, of course, there's also bids for ancillary services. So there's, regulation up, regulation down, and other ancillary services that storage resources potentially clear for in the market. When our day-ahead market runs, it co-optimizes between ancillary services and energy. So it's not just looking at is this resource making energy profits or is this resource making ancillary service profits. It's saying, given the system needs and the requirements that we have to operate the grid reliably, including energy and ancillary services, how do I do that in the least or in the most cost-effective way, the least cost solution? And that incorporates everyone's bids for all resources, including the spread bids for the storage resources. So essentially, when the day-ahead market runs and it's looking at and thinking about energy prices, by and large, it shouldn't dispatch a storage resource to charge at prices that are above the bids for the charge portion of the curve, Similarly, the day-ahead market also should not dispatch a storage resource to discharge at prices below the discharge price, or so you've got a 1, a 2, or 3, it should respect that spread. So if indeed prices turn out in the real-time market to be, the day-ahead market to be, say, $50 to charge the resource at the lowest prices of the day and $100 to discharge the resource, the market should realize that that $50 spread between 50 and 100 is more than the initial $30 spread and would schedule the resource to charge and discharge and essentially make that $50 spread. What it wouldn't do is, say, schedule the resource to charge for 4 hours and then only discharge for 3 hours. There would be some inefficiencies there. It would match the charging and the discharging, which is sort of what we say when we say, quote unquote, the day-ahead market today already accommodates spread bidding. It's not true spread bidding, but it does accommodate these limits, and it accommodates moving these spreads during the day-ahead market. So you certainly could have, so let's say you've got this resource that's bidding in the market at $20 to discharge, $50 to charge, or sorry, other way around, $20 to charge, $50 to discharge. You certainly could have a resource that has a position that's long in energy, buying energy for the day. So that position could be the case that prices were just particularly low on this day. The resource was bidding in to buy energy at prices less than $20. Prices were $15 for 4 hours a day, so during those 4 hours, the resource was scheduled to charge, and then maybe there was only 1 hour that prices were above 50, so the resource was only scheduled to discharge for one of those hours. So that certainly could be the result of a day-ahead market, and we would say that those energy prices might actually be neutral, and you might actually be negative in terms of the total revenues for energy bought and sold, but it wouldn't be a position necessarily that would receive DCR because you're still buying energy, quote unquote, profitably because it respects the day-ahead bid curve compared to what you've bid in the market. So sort of that's just level setting on what our day-ahead market does today, and we sort of understand that some folks may want the ability to sort of start the day at one state of charge and end the day at the same state of charge, so that essentially you're buying and selling the same amount of energy, and I think we're still thinking about what sort of implications that might have and whether or not that's something that we can implement given what we have currently in our software right now. And that's what we're talking about in the last few bullets here. So yeah, going on to the next slide here, slide 14. We do have some initial concerns about this. So by and large, when we've been thinking about it, generally we expect that resources will be discharging, storage resources to be discharging a lot of their energy towards the end of the day during those peak net load hours. So not necessarily the last few hours of the day, but they are close to the last few hours of the day. And prices in the market generally aren't lowest in those last few hours of the day. So we would expect a lot of times if resources were just profit maximizing, that they would be discharged to a fairly low state of charge towards hour ending 24 at the end of the day-ahead market. So we see that there could potentially be some problems of allowing a resource to have an end-of-day state of charge at 100%, because then it might be very challenging to sort of get this resource charged back up to 100% if it's discharging towards the end of the day. We know that prices tend to be a little bit higher than the lowest prices during those last few hours of the day, so it might be challenging to make that all balance. However, state of charge parameter less or closer to 0 may be more appropriate. So yeah, and I think that's what we're talking about here in the second bullet. The third bullet, the ISO would like to consider opportunities to mitigate these consequences. So we don't really want to have a state of charge parameter that would really prevent resources from running and being used and even scheduled by the day-ahead market software. So we want to think about the implications there before we just rush and implement something. And I think that's all we had to say about this parameter. So if we have any questions on that, Jimmy, or comments?
One question.
Perfect.
Your line is muted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Alva again. 2 points. One on the your statement that you could actually take a resource out of the money when you saw a $50 arbitrage, so that's well above the $30 arbitrage of the bids. My feeling is that both the presentation that SCE did, Bev Brereton did, and then our own experience, we have not seen that actually happen, and I'd be interested to know if it has. If it has, I'm happy, and I'd like to know that it's actually happening as opposed to just possibly could happen, because that would lead to some of that value being realized. The second point was just...
Yeah, my understanding, and I've talked to some folks who are fairly familiar with the details of the market optimization. They say that this certainly would happen with dispatches. So we can continue looking for live examples of this, but my understanding is that this would occur. Yeah.
I mean, my experience is it doesn't, so that's why it seems like it should be possible. It's possible it could occur if it would make enough of a difference in the system costs, because you're saving essentially you could see that you get a benefit of $50 out of doing that, even though you're paying out of the money for the charging. But I have not seen it in any of our market results. The other point I was going to make on the end-of-day effects, well, 2 things. One is, you focus on the things that are going to be continuing issues, because if somebody, sets their state of charge at maximum every day, they're going to also miss out on other opportunities. So I think something they might do on one particular day is not necessarily going to be something they're going to do every day. And so I think you need to look at sort of systematic opportunities and predictable opportunities where people can exploit that parameter to say that it's actually going to be a really high risk. But given that, I think you could also make some fairly simple rules about just saying end-of-day state of charge has to be within certain limits that you consider to be acceptable in terms of maximum and minimum, so that you don't just to forestall situations that you think are likely to be uneconomic. For example, if you were to say that the state of charge could be the same as the start of day state of charge, then you should always be able to have a net zero schedule, and so you shouldn't see the kind of situation you're talking about being an issue. I mean, even if you started the day at 100% and ended the day at 100%, the solution would have to be, the market solution would be one that could be a net zero solution unless there's benefit to the ISO from taking those bids and reduce costs. And so that would be, to me, would be an acceptable solution.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we are at a stage where we are welcoming feedback in that regard as far as moving forward with a proposal like this. So, Alva, I know you've been thinking about this, and I think you mentioned that Paul might be working on this as well. So to the extent that you guys could all, maybe we could sort of put our heads together, and I think certainly with other folks, market participants as well, just sort of think about what those parameters might be so that, the ISO and market participants get the most value out of their resources. I think that's where we want to go with this.
Absolutely.
So we don't want to necessarily... Yeah, we don't necessarily want to introduce something into our market where, either party is going to miss out, and potentially both parties might miss out because, somebody accidentally puts in something that's too high, and then suddenly, resources aren't clearing, ISO doesn't get any of the flexibility, the resources don't get any of the potential profits. I think that would be something we want to avoid.
Good point.
Yep. And to your first point about looking at the spreads, yeah, I think we will commit to continue to looking at that, and I think maybe we can coordinate with you and with Beverly and other market participants who are interested to try to just make sure that the market is working like that. But yeah, our understanding is that we do have those spreads in the market, and we want to make sure that they're being utilized for storage resources.
It'd be interesting to see if we could do that in market simulation, actually, and see if nobody's actually seen. And there may be participants who have, but I'm just not aware of anybody who has seen that. And so it'd be good to see if we could see the market doing that.
I agree. I think that'd be a great spot to look. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question?
Moving to our next question. Your lines are muted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley from the Western Power Trading Forum. I had a couple questions. So the first one, and I apologize, I came in just at the tail end of the end-of-hour state of charge parameter, but I just realized as you're going through this, that's only for real time, it sounds like, because I was confused on why you would need an end-of-day and an end-of-hour state of charge, because it seems like they'd overlap. But is that because you're not proposing it for the day-ahead market for some reason?
That's correct. Yeah, it is an end-of-hour for the real-time market only. And we didn't consider anything of an end-of-hour or anything like that in the day-ahead market because the day-ahead market optimizes over the 24-hour time horizon, while the real-time market has its limitations with its horizon.
Maybe this is a question for Bill. Are you allowed to do that per FERC? It was my understanding that you had to, for storage in particular, you had to offer the same optimization parameters for real-time and day-ahead. I'm forgetting the order, 841 maybe. Did you look into that at all?
Yeah, we have. I mean, Order 841 doesn't address this specifically, and if anything, I mean, Order 841 is very pro let the resource owner manage their state of charge, and we see this as a boon to help that. I mean, we can look into it a little more, but I don't have a significant legal concern at the moment.
All right, maybe it wasn't 841. It was one that was talking about recently about having similar parameters in the day ahead in real time and not significantly changing the optimization. I'll ask Callie. She'll remember it off the top of her head and shoot you a note. Okay, so then the second question, on the spread bidding, it sounded like to me you were saying that even if you were out of the money on one of the legs, that you thought the optimization would still respect the spread bid. Is that what you're saying, Gabe?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yep.
Yeah, I don't think it would, though, right? Because if you were out of the money on one of the legs, it would change the bid price, because now your margin it could set the LMP if you were out of the money. So it wouldn't take you if you set the LMP, because that would change the total cost of optimization.
No, I think I don't believe that it would set the price. I think because you're out of the money, it wouldn't necessarily set the price in the first leg, whereas it could potentially set the price in the second leg where it's in the money. But I think this kind of gets back to Eric's point about the day-ahead market optimizing over 24 hours. That's why it can make those trade-offs.
This is Greg.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Okay, Greg.
I mean, this is something hi, Carrie. One of the, and they're not here, but another group had actually seen this happening in real time, in the real-time market, and so I think we just need to find an example where we see it in the day-ahead market. The real-time market, you can't really, the user can't see it because they're, obviously the binding interval is the only one you see, but when we look at the multi-interval optimization runs, we can see this happening, so.
Oh, I see. Through the advisory pricing. Gotcha.
Right. The advisory. So it's anyway. So yeah. I think the point I think Gabe is like let's see this happening and see where an example that's happening in the day ahead, then everybody can see what's going on there.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I'll use this as an opportunity, since you brought up the advisory prices, to do my, every time we have a call or a meeting on this, to say that it would be very helpful if the CAISO could start publishing advisory prices in addition to binding prices, either through OASIS or just a one-off on Excel, so people can manage their storage resources better. Because I think some of the difficulties does come from the discrepancies between the advisory and binding prices.
Yep. Thanks, Gary. Any other questions?
Nope, that's it. Thanks, guys.
Great.
Yeah, just make sure to, if you can even just send me a quick email, I'd like to see which FERC order you're referencing, because we're not aware of it.
Yeah, I'll look it up, and I could have it wrong. If I find it, I'll send it. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Operator, any other questions?
No further questions.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to take on the next section and talk about the default energy bid for storage resources. So we're now on slide 16 for those of you who are following along. This is a continuation of the discussion that we've had in the last ESDR workshop. I know we were a little bit pressed for time in that meeting, and I suspect we may be a little bit tight on time in this meeting as well, but we do have about an hour and 20 minutes to sort of get through these slides. I also realized, and I've had a couple questions already from the paper that we published, that there's some math that some of the participants sort of want to go into more deeply. I'm not planning to do that on this call just because of the limited amount of time, but given where we are in the process, I feel like this is the first time we put out a proposal inclusive of all of the components of the default energy bid. So going forward, I think as we solidify what this proposal will look like and how this calculation is going to be carried out, we'll start to get into details of how we're going to actually do and crunch some of the numbers for all these different components, which may mean perhaps we need to do a one-off workshop or perhaps devote a little bit more time on this in the next paper. But with that said, I'll go through these slides right now, and we'll go through, like I said, the first full proposal that we put out for a default energy bid for storage resources. So this slide is largely background to the default energy bid conversation, and this is not new material, but essentially some of the reasons why we're moving forward with this is because the ISO currently does not calculate default energy bids for storage resources. Of course, this isn't such a big concern today because there's only about 150 megawatts of installed capacity on the system right now. However, there's a lot of new storage generation that's in our interconnection queue. So in just a few short years, there may be several thousand megawatts of installed storage on the system. Once we get to those kind of levels of penetration, there certainly could be instances when these resources could exercise market power, and to the extent that that's possible, we do want to make sure that we have default energy bids that are representative of what marginal cost should be for these resources. So that's sort of why we're thinking about this now, particularly in light of the potential RA shortfall that's been forecast by the CPUC and their most recent RA procurement proceeding. Just if we could go back. So storage, when the ISO and the CPUC have been thinking about storage in the past, they've often been suggested as a solution for local issues or for potential retirements of essential, including gas resources. So the idea would be that you could take gas resources offline, you could substitute for storage resources, you could charge those resources when the solar renewable resources are online, and use that charge later on in the day when peak loads are higher and potentially solar is offline. Planning models by the CPUC and the ISO tend to model storage resources as essentially being able to move energy for free, so they can take this energy from the lowest 4 price hours of the day and move energy to the highest price 4 hours of the day, and that's usually how they're modeled in those planning models the ISO and the CPUC carry out. I will say that the ISO has updated its transmission planning requirements so that they include a hurdle rate now, which is supposed to mirror an average price for a storage resource to operate. And essentially, if the price spread between the lowest prices of the day and the highest prices of the day aren't great enough to meet that hurdle rate, then the ISO, in its transmission planning process, won't be modeling these resources as moving energy. So that's one step that we've sort of taken to start encompassing some of these ideas about costs for storage resources in some of our planning processes. So if we go on to the next slide, this again is not any new material here, but the same graph that I've shown before where they're a potential storage resource, and this is a hypothetical day. Well, this is not a hypothetical day. This is an actual day. This is the load curve and net load curve on March 15, 2019. But a theoretical storage resource could be used to charge during the hours of, say, 11 in the morning to hour ending 15 or hour ending 16. And take that energy that's stored and use it to serve load during the peak net loads of the day, which would be hours ending 19, 20, 21, and potentially during a morning peak load of hour ending 7 or 8. So go to the next slide. Thank you. So the idea would be that most of the resources for our storage horizon would be used and charged and discharged, which would translate to energy schedules. When we actually look at the data, and this is data for the first half of 2019, what we see here, sort of those lime green bars that are very close to zero and the purple bars that are very close to zero, are the actual energy storage schedules for storage resources for the 150 megawatts of storage that we have installed on the system. So what we see is that there's a little bit of discharge in hours ending 8 and 9, and then there's some discharge in hours ending 19, 20, 21, but by and large these resources aren't moving energy from certain parts of the day to other parts of the day, and the charging tends to be relatively constant throughout most of the day, not very much in terms of megawatts, particularly when we think about the entire capacity of the storage fleet at 150 megawatts. What we do see are the light blue bars and the dark blue bars, which correspond to schedules for regulation up and regulation down, which is primarily what most of these resources are clearing for. So by and large, they're getting schedules for either reg up or reg down, hour in and hour out, which is largely how these resources are being dispatched in the real-time market. We don't think that this is necessarily something that's uneconomic that's happening here. Really what we see going on is that storage resources do incur costs as they're cycled, as they're storing energy and charging and discharging. So because those costs might be significantly high, they may not be high enough to overcome the actual price differences between the lowest price times of the day and the highest price times of the day. So if we go to the next slide, okay. Just as a little bit of a framework on that last slide, we are seeing typically price spreads between the lowest price times of the day and the highest price times of the day in the evening ramp of about $40 per megawatt hour, and then in the morning ramp, when there is bimodal peaking on the system, we see price spreads of about $15, which corresponds roughly to what that last picture showed. So thinking about where we want to go with default energy bids in the ISO, again, this particular slide is not something that's new, but it is where we outline the four major components that we're thinking about including in the default energy bid for storage resources. Those four major components include energy, losses, cycling costs, and opportunity costs for the resources. So the energy component, we need to think about this for storage resources because it's important. So the price that the resource pays to purchase energy from the energy market is relevant in how much that they're willing to sell it for. Obviously, if there's some cost for them to operate, then they would apply this cost on top of the energy costs that they actually procure the energy at. Now, in the model that we're going to outline in the next few slides, we think about energy and when it's procured. It may be procured the day before a particular market run, or it may be procured the actual day of the market run for discharge later on in that same day. Losses are they sort of come in two different flavors. They come in round-trip efficiency losses, which is more relevant to lithium-ion batteries. And there's also parasitic losses, which does not impact lithium-ion batteries as much. Just a caveat here, most of the resources we see in our system and in our queue are lithium-ion batteries today. We anticipate that a bulk of what's built in the next few years would be lithium-ion. When we're thinking about the framework that we're building for storage resources and their default energy bid, we want to have something that could potentially accommodate more than just specific lithium-ion batteries. So we're trying to be a little bit more broad and a little bit more holistic in what we're thinking about for solution here, and trying to build something that will work for other resources as they join if technology changes down the road and we sort of move away from lithium ion. But we want to make sure we get round-trip efficiency losses right, because those will be applied to lithium ion batteries. So round-trip efficiency losses have to do with, let's say you charge the battery for 10 megawatt hours from energy on the grid. That resource might only be capable of discharging 9.5 megawatt hours back onto the grid because of the round-trip efficiency losses. Parasitic losses are more when that same resource charges up with 10 megawatt hours of energy, and that 10 megawatt hours is stored. That 10 megawatt hours slowly degrades to 9.9, 9.7 megawatts, and those parasitic losses occur over time, and they're a function of how much energy is actually stored in the storage resource at that time. So those are your loss costs. We think that the most challenging costs to sort of get our hands around and what we're sort of still continuing to look for feedback and input on are cycling costs. These are challenging to think about, and they're different than a lot of the costs that we have for the resources that we have on the grid today. But storage resources degrade essentially with each cycle that they run. The actual cells themselves are made up of metal, and as you charge the cell and discharge the cell, that metal begins to fatigue and actually break down. Eventually, that fatigue causes the cell to perform worse and worse over time, and eventually it will perform so bad that the cell needs to be replaced, and those replacement costs are really what we're thinking about when we're thinking about cycling costs. We've learned that cells may degrade faster with deeper cycles. So if you charge the battery all the way up to 100% and then discharge that resource down to 0%, that's a particularly deep discharge. However, that pattern of operation is a lot different than charging a resource up to 60% and then discharging it down to 50%, and then say doing that even 10 times degrades a battery significantly less than even one of the very deep charges where you charge all the way up to 100% and then discharge down to 0%. We think it's critical that these cycling costs are included in the default energy bids, as they're directly related to storage resource operation. So obviously, if you are mid-cycle and the cycle is moving from a semi-deep state to a particularly deep state, that marginal cost of cycling the resource even more is something that we think storage resource owners would be thinking about as they're operating the resource. Of course, this is all the modeling on cycling costs is all probabilistic, so it depends resource by resource how much degradation actually occurs, but we think we can model these things relatively consistently and reliably at the level that we need to make dispatch instructions. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, just given the current market conditions and what prices we actually see in the real-time market, it may be more expensive for these resources to operate than we actually see price spreads existing in the market. That's sort of what we're showing on the last slide. And that's directly related to the cycling costs. And if these resources were to be involved in particularly deep dispatches, we think those deep dispatches may be, in fact, more expensive than the, say, $40 price spreads that we see on average in our markets. Finally, we want to make sure that we incorporate something that's consistent with opportunity costs. This is something that we've had a lot of feedback from DMM on. It could be the case that the 4 highest priced hours, you've got a 4-hour storage resource. The 4 highest priced hours a day could be back-to-back during that net load peak. And let's just assume that price is $100 for all 4 hours. If the interval before those 4 consecutive $100 hours was $95, what you wouldn't want to do is discharge the resource at $95, which essentially would cause you to miss out on one of the $100 hour prices in the next successive 4 hours. So we want to make sure we've incorporated that thinking into the default energy bid for these resources to make sure that they're not missing out on opportunities just because prices may look high in 1 hour, even though we anticipate higher prices in future hours. So we've come up with a formulation on how to capture that and how to think about that in the next few slides. I'm going to pause there just to check and see if there's any questions at a high level before we start diving into the details. So if you have any question, if you've read ahead and you sort of are thinking about the paper and you have questions about one of the 4 components, the details of it, maybe we'll take those as we get into those sections. But any high-level questions about modeling batteries, I think we can take those now. Operator?
Our first question, your lines are muted. Please go ahead.
Yep.
Your line may be muted. Please unmute your phone.
Hi, this is Adam Swadley from BMM.
Hi, Adam.
Hey, Gabe, I just have one question for you. In mentioning the queue, you said there was, you mentioned the large volume of storage that's in the queue. Do you have a sense of how much that is intended to be standalone storage resources versus hybrid resource?
That's a great question, Adam. A lot of, what's in the queue may not be built, and I don't have a good sense of where all of it stands. I do know, that in the next several years, just looking at the potential RA shortfall and the procurement track that the CPUC is sort of moving forward on, there is likely to be a lot of new storage built. We think that it may be quicker to co-locate some of these storage resources at the same locations as solar facilities today because interconnection is already there, the inverter is already built. You might not need to do a whole lot more work besides installing the battery and incur additional costs. So that may be attractive for some developers, but as far as actual hard numbers go, I don't have any.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I'm just wondering because, we have sort of concurrently going on right now this hybrid resources initiative, and it seems like a significant amount of the capacity may be in that form, and we haven't heard anything about default energy bids or any other type of cost modeling in that initiative. So I was wondering, what the potential overlap may be.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I know that in the Hybrid Resources Initiative, they're tackling a lot of issues, so it's not just the cost component. But I would recommend that there at least be some crossover and some collaboration between this initiative where we're thinking just about the storage resources and potentially that hybrid initiative where they're thinking about all the things related to hybrid resources and not just, battery costs. So maybe some comments along those lines might be helpful from DMM.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for the comment.
Moving to the next in the queue, your lines are muted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bora Akil from 8 Minutes Solar Energy. I just wanted to second your suggestion about having a technical workshop on the cycling costs or the default energy bid for storage. I think that we have submitted some comments on this in the prior iteration, and from what I've seen, I don't think our comments have been addressed, and there may be a good reason for that. I would love to get together maybe a technical workshop in Folsom and kind of dive deeper into these equations that you submit, because I think there's a lot of value in an interactive discussion versus, these ongoing web meetings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good comment. I think there has been some reluctance to sort of sit down and spend too much time going through those derivations to date, just because, of where we were in the policy development. This is really the first time we've included everything in a full-blown model for the default energy bid. But now that we have this derivation, I think you're exactly right. Now is the time to actually dive into some of these numbers. Obviously, like you say, we can't get into all of the minutia of how these things are going to work today with just the hour and a half that we have to talk about it. So to the extent that we do want to get into those details, I think setting something like that up might be valuable, and we'll continue to reach out to stakeholders like yourself to think about how we might best accomplish that. But I appreciate that comment.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Moving to the next in the queue, your lines are muted. Please go ahead.
Good morning. This is Kanya Dorland with the CPUC. I was calling regarding the first bullet on energy. I just want to confirm that consistent with 8401, you would be assuming that the energy procured from the market would be at the local marginal price. And then would you need to factor in transmission costs for delivering energy or charging?
No, not for an ISO resource. You shouldn't need to figure in any kind of transmission costs. You would need to figure in the LMP though, because that's the price that the resource would actually have to buy the energy at. Now, of course, embedded in the LMP are losses and congestion components for all resources on the system. But those would need to be considered, and that's what we're going to outline in our formulation for that value in the next few slides.
Okay, and then following on Adam's with DMM's question about hybrid resources, yeah. They would be charging without, I'm assuming, without paying for energy if they're next to solar. And the hybrid resources paper had noted that in July, 41% of the capacity in the interconnection queue is hybrid. And then I checked, and as of October, 49% of the capacity in the interconnection queue is hybrid resources. So there seems to be a growing trend to not just do solar or wind by itself, but with storage. And should we assume that if it's paired with a renewable resource, it's not paying for energy, or is it? And then is that factored into the default energy bid?
Yeah, I think those are really good questions. I think, and maybe I wasn't terribly clear about this, but to Adam's question, we haven't really thought a whole lot about default energy bids for hybrid resources. But I think all of the questions that you're asking are relevant, and the ISO should probably spend a little bit of time thinking about that. And there probably should be a little bit of overlap between what we're doing here and how this framework could potentially apply to the hybrid resources. Because, like you say, and I think the ISO would also say this, we anticipate that there could be a lot of storage resources or hybrid resources on the system in the next few years. But I think that's a valid point.
Thank you.
And I appreciate you having those numbers handy. That's helpful.
Yeah, it's approximately 36,684 megawatts with online dates from 2019 to 2025, but we don't know how much of that will actually come to fruition. So,
Of course, yeah. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Moving to the last in the queue, your line's muted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Alva at PG&E. I think this slide, this does identify the sources of cost in storage resources. I think the lift in terms of what you're talking about is why you would need to make DEBs dynamic in any sense, even varying by hour in advance of the market, let alone varying by hour within the market, because I think these costs are costs that any market participant would see and would incorporate into their bids, and the ISO might then say that there are limits in terms of what they are willing to accept when mitigation is necessary. But none of that necessarily requires the more detailed and granular model that I still see you proposing. So I think that's where I'd really like to hear a stronger argument as to why there's a need to make this jump in the concept of default energy bids, which doesn't occur anywhere else in the implementation of default energy bids or market power mitigation, to the idea of a dynamic default energy bid. Thank you.
Yeah, Alva, I think that's a good question. I think the reason why we're thinking about making these dynamic is because of the cycling costs. When you think about a gas resource, as the gas resource runs, it doesn't impact how much cost the resource actually incurs. You still take, you take the fuel in, you pay for the fuel, you multiply by the heat rate, you add on things like greenhouse gas adders, and grid management charges and other things like that, and can come up with a reasonable approximation with how much it costs to run a gas resource. When you're thinking about a storage resource, it's different because as you run the storage resource and it gets deeper into those cycles, the cost to run it incrementally actually increase, or at least that's from the literature that we've read, that's how we understand that these costs work. So that's sort of why our position is, where we're at currently. I see what you're saying. Maybe there's a simpler, or maybe this is what you're saying, maybe there's a simpler way that we could model these resources that we wouldn't have to sort of jump through all these hoops that could maybe work. But I think from our perspective, from how we're seeing costs described and modeled in literature, matches up with a sort of a different paradigm than how we're running market optimization today. Now, that said, we think, talking with our market specialist folks, we could actually implement and build something like this, and it would be reasonable to accommodate, even several hundred units that would need to be maximized or cost minimized to solve our model. So sort of that's where we're at on that question, but I think it's good to kind of level set and check back in on that as we develop this further. And certainly, PG&E has a lot of expertise in operating these resources and participating in the market, so we'd like to get sort of that kind of feedback from you guys and other market participants as well, if there are places we could sort of make this less complicated, maybe.
Right, and I don't think, I don't think we have experience with the dynamically looking at the cost of cycling, but certainly the cost of energy is equally volatile, and it has to be captured through some form of forecast. And so basically, just like you sort of in advance determine what you think is kind of going to be the case, first of all, that's how you're going to be doing your bidding as a market participant. It seems to me like the ISO could take the same approach in terms of how it's going to mitigate. You're trying to determine whether a particular bid in a particular hour it could be exercising market power, and the idea that you're going to not even know whether your bid you have no idea what it's being pinned to until the market, and then possibly even within the market, seems to go against the idea that you could possibly have that kind of ability to drive price, because the default energy bid itself is going to be almost completely unpredictable.
Yeah, and towards the end of the paper, we sort of echo that with hey, so point taken for sure. And sort of towards the end of the paper, we sort of echo that idea and say, hey, look, we need to have a bidding construct that's as flexible as the default energy bid, so you can bid the same thing that's in your default energy bid. And right. We understand that resources aren't going to be in there updating their bids every 5 minutes to account for, hey, I got dispatched last interval, my prices are going to go up incrementally by X percent. I need to include that. But to the extent that you can provide an adder or a multiplier to the ISO that we can apply as the resource does get dispatched, then ideally those bids and the default energy bids would move in lockstep, and you really would have this very agile market feature that says, well, hey, look, across the board, as I'm dispatching my battery fleet, they're getting incrementally more expensive, and I need to, if that's going to be prohibitive eventually down the road, I need to start thinking about that and incorporating that into my cost minimization model.
Okay, well, that sounds like an interesting idea, and I hope you will have a workshop where you go through the math on that, because I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah. It's complicated, of course, but I think to the extent that we can continue to work with PG&E and the other stakeholders on this, we definitely like your feedback on stuff like that as well. But we want to build something that works and is valuable for you guys and for us.
Thank you.
Yep. Operator, any other calls or questions on the queue?
No further questions in the queue.
Okay, so we'll dive right into it. So we've got some of the equations here. So we start getting into the math, the fun bit of the morning. So I hope everybody has their coffee ready. But the first factor that we're thinking about contributing to the default energy bids, as we've alluded to, are the energy prices. And the way that we plan to model them are included here in this equation, and this is really the outline of how we're thinking about doing the default energy bids, inclusive of all those components that we just talked about. So it's going to be the maximization of two separate pieces. The first piece is the energy piece and the cycle depth piece, and then the second piece is the opportunity costs. The idea here is that you'd have to purchase the energy. The energy, would be purchased in the market at expected prices that we'd be calculating, and that's laid out in future slides. And then those prices would actually be amplified or magnified by the round-trip efficiency losses. What we don't have in this equation is any idea about the parasitic losses. I haven't sort of wrapped my head around how to model those yet. So if anyone, market participants, have comments on how to model parasitic losses, we're seeking feedback on that so that we can include it in this equation as well. And of course, the other component of cost is the cycle depth cost, which is added to the price that you're going to pay for energy. And then you're going to compare that to the opportunity cost. So again, like I said, if we know prices are going to be highest during a 4-hour block, and those prices or expect prices to be highest during a 4-hour block, and we expect those prices to be $100, you wouldn't want to sell energy at less than $100. So we need to make sure that that value is incorporated in the default energy bid. And this is how we do it with this maximization piece. And then finally, like most of the default energy bids that the ISO calculates, we're going to add an extra 10% onto this calculation just to make sure, if there's any kind of variance, if there's any kind of issue with how precise this calculation is, there's a little bit of wiggle room on that. So in this equation, EN represents energy costs. So these are costs or expected costs for the resource to purchase energy. Lambda, the Greek letter there, is representative of losses, and these are really capturing the round-trip efficiency losses that by and large are captured for lithium-ion resources or impactful for lithium-ion resources. So from the fleet today, we know that round-trip efficiency losses generally range from anywhere of around the low 80s to maybe the mid 90%. So some of the round-trip efficiency losses might be 90%. If that were the case, we'd calculate what we expect energy prices to be. We'd divide that by 0.9, and then we'd come up with our total cost to procure energy for the resource. That's how that works. CD is the cycle depth cost or cycle cost. And cycle cost is the dollars per megawatt hour in terms of cell degradation used to operate the resource, and we'll talk about, and this is sort of, we'll get into more details about how the CD is actually calculated in a future slide. And then we've got opportunity cost. So this is just a value that's going to be used and calculated on a daily basis that would make sure that the resource isn't dispatched before the highest 4 hours of the day, or however long the storage resource is capable of storing energy for. So if we go on to the next slide, slide 22 here. We'll get that. So if we advance to the next slide, there we go. Okay. So this is talking about cycling costs. So we're thinking about, we've outlined this in the paper, and we've sort of got a methodology outlined by an academic paper, and it talks about how cycle depth works relative to total cost and relative to marginal cost. So we just want to outline a few of the principles that are in that paper. And the reason why we're spending so much time going through this is because they're important in understanding how the default energy bid is formed, particularly around cycle depth. So what this says is that every incremental 10% that the resource discharges comes with an incremental marginal cost of $2 here in this case. So to discharge the resource at 10%, it costs $1 is the marginal cost, which also equals the total cost. To increment from 10% to 20%, it costs an additional $3 on top of the first dollar, so you get a total cost of $4. If you increment all the way down or dispatch all the way down 70%, so you start at 100% state of charge, discharge all the way down to 30, or it could be starting at 70%, discharge all the way down to 0, you're going to incur a total cost of $49. The marginal cost for that last incremental discharge would be $13, or the difference between $49 and $36 from a 60% cycle depth charge. We also note here at the bottom that cells may degrade faster based on current rate, ambient temperature, overcharge or discharge, and the average state of charge. So these are all different factors that go into how quickly cells go from being very performant to non-performant. However, the key contributor that we've heard, and we've heard from folks who operate storage resources and folks who think about from an academic point of view batteries, we've heard that the primary driver of cell degradation is the cycle depth figure, and these other factors are factors, but they tend not to be as great as the cycle depth. So the cycle depth is the main driver, and that's why we're really trying to model that here and figure out how that works. So if we go on to the next slide, we're sort of thinking about these cycle depths and how they relate to total cost. And generally, it doesn't really matter, by and large, if you're thinking about a storage resource like this on our system, how quickly that resource is actually discharged. If the resource is scheduled in hour ending 2, as it is here on the left, for a dispatch instruction of 4 megawatts, it's a 10 megawatt hour resource, and the initial state of charge is 7 megawatt hours. The 4 megawatt schedule will bring the resource down to 3 megawatt hours of charge. So your state of charge goes from 70% down to 30% in that 1 hour. The total cost associated with that from the previous table on slide 22 is $16, and there's no other dispatch instructions to the resource. So the total cost for operating that resource for that one discharge is $16. Similarly, that resource could be dispatched for 1 megawatt per hour ending 2, 3, 4, and 5. And when that happens, you sort of arrive at the same state, right? You start at a state of charge of 7 megawatt hours, you discharge all the way down to a state of charge of 3 megawatt hours, or from 70% again back down to 30%, and we see how the costs are incurred. And now, instead of incurring the entire total cost of $16 in 1 hour, you're incurring those marginal costs from operating the resource at just discharging 10% state of charge hour over hour. So the first hour you incur a cost of $1, the next hour you incur a cost of $3, $5, $7, and you notice that the total at the end of the day for both dispatch instructions or both sets of dispatch instructions are $16 total. And that's sort of what we're illustrating here on this slide. And this is applicable, too, when we think about dispatching the resource, even in the 5-minute interval. Now, the costs may not quite go up by the same amount, obviously, in the 5-minute interval as they would in the hour-long interval, but they're still going to vary if you were based on whether or not you were dispatched during the last iteration of the market optimization. So that's what we want to focus on here. So on the next slide, we sort of go through one other example where you have this idea that you could charge and discharge the resource, and you sort of have nested discharge periods. So in the first two lines of this chart should look fairly familiar because it's the same thing that we did on the left side of the previous chart. So essentially, an hour ending 2, we've got a dispatch instruction of 4 megawatts. That brings the total state of charge of the resource from 7 megawatt hours down to 3 megawatt hours, or 70% down to 30%. We already know the cost for that. We've done that twice now. The total cost is $16. An hour ending 3, though, we do something different. We actually schedule the resource to charge for 2 megawatts. So that's going to bring the state of charge from 3 megawatt hours up to 5 megawatt hours, or 30% up to 50%. We're only, in our models, we're only modeling discharging as associated with costs. We're not modeling charging associated with additional costs. So as you discharge, you incur additional costs. As you charge, you don't. So the additional cost here for hour ending 3, that dispatch instruction to charge for 2 megawatts is 0. And then an hour ending 4, we're going to discharge that 2 megawatts. And this is where things get a little bit nuanced because, again, we're moving from a state of charge of 5 megawatt hours down to 3 megawatt hours or 50% to 30%. And the cost we're incurring here is $4. And it's not an incremental of $9 or $11 or $20. It's actually only $4 because this is a nested charge and discharge period. So it's as if we had started the resource back at 70 again and started to discharge from there, from 70 to 50 would be the same marginal cost of 4 or $1 for the first megawatt and then $3 for the second megawatt for a total of 4 megawatts. And that's why we have these numbers here, an hour ending 4. And then hour ending 5, we're basically extending the first discharge period. So in the first discharge period, we discharged 4 megawatts, and now the fifth megawatt, the incremental cost there is $9, and then an hour ending 6 to 6, incremental cost is $11. So when we add all these costs together, we get a total cost of $40. So that's how you in this factoring the cycle aging cost of batteries participating in electricity markets academic paper outlines and characterizes how these costs actually work with resources, which is fairly nuanced. So if you go to the next slide, slide 25, he uses what's called a rain flow model. And basically he partitions the battery into 10 different segments representing 10% state of charge, with each segment representing 10% state of charge. Each of those segments can either be charged or discharged, and then there's also a cost associated with discharging any of those particular segments. So the idea with the rain flow model is that you track this matrix of 10 digits representing either charge or discharge for every interval for the resource. And then when you're charging the resource, you charge the least expensive portions of the battery first, so the portions of the battery that have the lowest marginal cost first, and then on to the highest cost segments of the battery. So if the battery was completely discharged, the vector would look like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then when you charge the first, if you charge, say, 2 megawatts in the first interval or 20% of the battery, you would charge the first bit and the second bit, which would have, if discharged, a marginal cost of $1 and $3. And then when you discharge the resource, you always discharge the resource at the least expensive portions or segments of the curve first. So if the first segment was charged, you would always discharge that first, and the second segment, if that was charged, you discharge that second. And that sort of does the math for these nested discharges that we talked about in the last slide. However, keeping track of a segmented state of charge would be extremely difficult for the ISO to do, and it's a cost minimization problem. Of course, each of these charge bits, either ones or zeros, the binaries there, would be additional binaries that would need to be introduced into our cost minimization model. And each time we do that, it makes our total math problem more complicated. And eventually, adding enough of these, we get to a point where we wouldn't be able to solve the problem in the time that we've got to actually get to a solution. So this is sort of the theoretical framework of how the model for cycle depth works that we've outlined in the last few slides, but something that's too complicated and not practical for us to implement in our models. So I'm going to go on to the next slide here. Let me just see what this is. This is our definition of cycle depth, and we'll talk about this, and then I'll pause for questions. So this is sort of what we want to do with our actual cycle depth calculation, and this is the CD that we would have in that formula that we showed a few slides ago, where we're actually modeling our default energy bid for storage resources, and this is what it would look like. It would contain just a single binary for the resource, and it would be 1 when the resource is discharging. So again, it would be, okay, we are associating a discharge with additional cost for the resource, and it would be a 0 otherwise. So if the battery was being dispatched at 0, so not charging or discharging, or if it was charging, there wouldn't be an additional CD on the marginal cost for the resource. And then each of these binaries would be specific to a resource and a time interval. And then there would be another Greek letter, a rho here, which would be a constant value. And this constant value would really capture the cost of a discharge, and that would be something that would be provided by the resources or the resource owners, and that value would be representative of the cycle depth cost. And it would also be something that would be validated like any other master file parameter as it was submitted to the ISO. And then we've also got a factor here that's maximum stated charge. Generally, this would be 100% for most resources. Of course, it could be less if a resource has specified a lower maximum stated charge than 100%, which is a parameter that can be entered into a market. And then the final term in this equation is also the SOC, which is the stated charge, which is the market decision variable. So if the ISO determines or wants to discharge the resource on a lower stated charge, then it would have an additional cost. The CD component would be positive because the binary value would be 1. The rho is a constant value. You take the difference between the maximum stated charge, 100, minus the actual stated charge, which could be, if it's something 70%, you could have a value there of maybe 0.3. So you multiply that 0.3 times the rho value, and you come up with your cycle depth cost for that specific interval. I've come up with a very simple example here that we could actually do this for a specific resource in the RTD. So this is a 5-minute market. So let's just assume we've got a resource that can be charged at 24 megawatts. So it can receive dispatch instructions of negative 24 all the way up to positive 24. And positive 24 dispatch instruction would be the resource discharging at 24 megawatts or providing 24 megawatts of energy to the grid. And then the resource, again, just to make the math easy, let's pretend it has 100 megawatt hours of storage capacity. And then we've done some calculations and verified that the rho value for this specific resource should equal $20 or $20. And that value would be applied to the CD in this, the cycle depth cost in this formulation. And then the maximum stated charge here is indeed 100% for this resource. So if we go to the next slide, and I promise this is the last one before I pause for questions, if that resource at any particular time, so let's just assume we're at time t plus 1, we're at a stated charge of 100%. The cycle depth cost there, if we were going to dispatch the resource at 12 megawatts, that would deplete, again, if this is a 5-minute market, that would deplete 1 megawatt hour out of the battery, or 1% of cycle depth. And we can multiply 0.01 times the rho value of 20, which would give us a total cycle depth cost of 20 cents. If instead of discharging the resource at $12, we discharge the resource at 24 megawatts, that would be a discharge of 2 megawatt hours of energy, or a total of 2% of the total 100 megawatt hours for that particular resource. 0.02 times the $20 value per rho would get you a total cycle depth cost of 40 cents. That's interval time t plus 1. You can have another interval time t plus x where the resource has already been dispatched down to a 40% stated charge. So the current stated charge is 40% now. Again, the market has the choice to charge the resource all the way up to minus 24 megawatts, or to discharge the resource anywhere from 0 megawatts up to 24 megawatts. If the market determines, again, this is the internal variable that would be decided by the market optimization. If it decides to dispatch the resource at 12 megawatts, that would deplete an additional megawatt hour from the resource, bringing the total cycle depth up to 61% instead of 60%, which would be, 100% minus 40. That would be associated with 0.61 times that $20 rho value, or $12.20. If the dispatch instruction was indeed 24 megawatts at the Pmax of the resource, that would be associated with the 62% cycle depth, or 0.62 times $20, which would be $12.40, which would be the additional cycle depth adder to the default energy bid. So that sort of outlines the process that we're thinking about using for this cycle depth component of the default energy bid. So I know that's a lot to digest, but we'll stop there for questions. Operator, any questions on the phone?
Lines are muted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Gabe. This is Michael Volpe from PG&E. If you can go back to slide 24. So I'm wondering why you didn't adopt the language used in the paper to describe the nested discharge as a full cycle at 20% state of charge. Or, sorry, 20% depth of discharge.
I think that's a fair point. I was trying to make this a little bit simpler and a little easier to digest. I hope I did not further complicate it.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that, you know, it may increase confusion if we talk about cycles as if they're one kind of flat idea, and that we don't go into the details of, you know, if you discharge, that is half of a cycle.
Yep.
So I think maybe as we're in the early stages, I mean, it may be something to think about, since, you know, I think everything is going to build off of this, so we may end up in a situation where folks are still talking about cycling with the idea that it's 100% to zero only, whereas you can cycle around any state of charge. You could have full cycles of, you know, 10% cycle depth or 20% cycle depth, and I think the you know, the paper uses that for the rainflow model, and I think might be helpful to clarify that early.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think in an earlier version of the paper we did have some sort of common definitions, and maybe we'll bring that back for later papers. You know, perhaps if you've got some other ideas about maybe ways to clarify and clean this up, or maybe common misconceptions about these things. You know, sometimes when you're, you know, in the weeds and thinking about the details of this so much, you sort of lose sight of sort of the high-level key points that we should be hitting on. But if you have a few of those and want to maybe shoot me an email about that, I'd be happy to kind of go over those and make sure they're included in the next version of the paper.
Sure. Thanks.
Or, you know, and future conversations about this. Thanks, Michael. Operator, next call.
Your line is now unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, this is Alva. Going back to slide 27 where you were, just one thing to point out there. So clearly you get, just looking at your slides, you get a much higher bid cap, as it were, if you're at a lower state of charge on average. Anecdotally, I've heard that that's actually preferred for lithium-ion batteries, that they would generally, from the perspective of extending the battery life, they prefer to stay at a lower state of charge rather than at 100%. And so you might have an unforeseen result here where you're enabling a market participant to operate at the level that is really best for them and exercise market power and not get what you might be looking for, which is more absolute energy available to the market, and that may not be what you're looking for, but clearly in this case the incentive is going to be for the market participants to try to keep their operations at a lower state of charge on average in order to be able to extract more revenue if they, in fact, did have market power.
Yeah, Alva, I think you bring up a really good point there, and we've also spoken with some battery experts, and we understand that the same thing is true. Generally, lithium-ion batteries perform better, and they're more cost-effective when they're operated at lower state of charges. So we agree with that. One of the things that you mentioned that was interesting is, you know, we sort of have this ability through a default energy bid to compel a resource to discharge and to move to those lower states of charge. At this point, outside of things like exceptional dispatch, we don't have a whole lot of tools to really compel a resource to charge up and perhaps be available and be ready for a situation where the ISO might need energy that a resource could charge. Your point is also well taken that there's an interaction here between prices and costs and state of charge that may also come up with market results where these resources are unloaded more often than they're loaded. So, I think there's interesting things to think about, and we want to continue thinking about all those issues. Incidentally, in the RA enhancements initiative, we are talking a little bit about operationalizing storage resources, and in that conversation, we are thinking about tools that the ISO may need to sort of compel a resource to charge, or to make sure our storage fleet is charged and ready when we need those resources for reliability or local needs.
Interesting. I think certainly a resource would have no problem bidding their full range and still keeping this kind of a strategy, because particularly with the use of state of charge restrictions. So I think you'd have a hard time. I mean, you're going to have to develop a whole new methodology for compelling resources to build up their state of charge to a place that is not to their advantage by battery lifetime, and it's not to their advantage based on what you're then going to require them to be mitigated to in the market. So it's an interesting problem.
The one other thing I would say about that is there is the incentive, though, of course, to capture high market prices later on in the day. I agree. The resource by and large may just prefer to be at a uncharged state, but to the fact that that the prices are going to be particularly high, say in a 4-hour period in the evening, you may want to be charged for that. So there could be some economic incentive there to sort of quote unquote do the right thing.
Right. Yeah. But it may not take full charge in order to be able to get those benefits.
Yeah. We agree, and we want to. I think the ISO and you are saying the same things in that we want to think about those sort of edge cases and outliers and make sure we haven't overlooked something in implementing this. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Alpha. Okay, operator, next question.
Your line is now unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Gautam from 8 Minute Solar. I have a question on page 26.
Yes.
In this you have rho, which is the constant. Just wondering how rho is calculated.
So I think that sort of is the trick with this, right? Because what you want rho to do is to sort of approximate this cell degradation cost. So as you cycle the resource and eventually have to replace cells, you'll need to think about that in terms of individual dispatches and say, well, hey, look, if I'm dispatched one more megawatt or one additional percentage of state of charge, how much is that going to impact how much I'm actually going to have to pay for those replacements? And from our understanding, there are models out there that look at probabilities of cell degradation. So you can actually say, well, hey, look, if I'm cycling this much, I know that I'm going to incur the likelihood of cell degradation is this amount. Given that likelihood of cell degradation, I'm expecting to have to replace my batteries and incur X amount of cost at this time. And then from that X amount of cost incurred, you should be able to use that number to back into how rho is calculated. But I agree, that's sort of the tricky bit about this. And as you'll see in the next few slides, there's sort of an alternate calculation that we've outlined, and that would have a completely different formulation for rho than what we've thought about here in this version of the calculation. Now that said, rho wouldn't be something that the ISO sort of pulls out of a hat. It would be specific to each resource, and it would be something that like other master file parameters, resource owners or scheduling coordinators would come to the ISO and they would say, hey, look, here's the math that I've done that shows the probability of my cell degradation, and here's what we expect costs to be for replacement for cells in the future. And then using these numbers, this is the value that we think is appropriate for rho, and this is what we want to apply to our resource. And that value would then be stored in master file and could be updated periodically like other master file values, but it would also be subject to ISO scrutiny and overview. So we take a look at other similar resources and make sure that these values are in line with those resources and calculations are coming up with similar values. But it would be a process that would work, that there would be coordination with between the ISO and the resource operator.
Okay. So sounds like it's like something like a tolling cost for the system operation, and then the ISO and the market participants would basically come up with that number, and then the ISO in turn would check if it's within the bounds of what the number could be. Okay. The only concern I have there is that some plants may not review their equipment. They may have some basically agreement not to review some of the equipment that are used in the system. So that could be a possible hurdle for this, but I'm not sure how big of a hurdle it might be.
Yeah, so I know with a lot of the other information that resource owners share with the ISO, there's and Bill can talk more about this, but there's non-disclosure agreements in place between the owners and the ISO. There's other, a lot of other information is shared. So we sort of see this as being akin to that other information that's already provided by resources.
Okay, thank you.
But I think, but I do think the tricky part about this specific value is it's not something that you can point to and say, oh, hey, the nameplate capacity of my resource is 100 megawatts. It's something that actually has to be calculated, which may take a little bit of work.
Yeah, especially if you have to tailor it for every single market participant, I would think that it would be very arduous on the ISO side if you have to do it for every single storage participant.
Yeah, it may be or it may not be. The other thing, like with a lot of these elements that the ISO already collects, we've got other similar resources that are already, as we've mentioned, there's a lot of storage in the queue. A lot of it is lithium ion. Likely a lot of it's from the same manufacturer. To the extent that we do get similar kinds of batteries by the same manufacturer, I would be surprised if these values didn't turn out being very similar to one another. So as the ISO gets experience with collecting this data, we might be able to put some reasonableness thresholds in place where we can say, oh yeah, this number is very much in line with other numbers we've received, let's go ahead and put it in, rather than going through the full process of scrutinizing the values and the calculations with every single submission.
Yeah, okay, makes sense.
Yeah, but that's an excellent question, and I'm glad you brought that up, so thank you. Operator, any other questions?
Yes, caller, your line is now unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, Gabe. This is Beverly Burton, Southern California Edison. Can you go back to slide 20?
Of course.
The lambda that you have in that equation, is it round-trip efficiency or round-trip efficiency losses?
It's round-trip efficiency.
Okay. Well, that makes sense because what you have on the slide is losses, and therefore, if you end up using the loss factor, you will end up with a very large number, and the opportunity cost will make sense in that setting.
Beverly, I think that's just a typo.
Okay.
Maybe was too fast.
Yeah, because it's also in the paper. It's in the paper.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'll go through and clean those up.
Yeah, so let's go back.
Right. Yep.
Let's go back now to the slide you're on for the cycling depth.
Yeah. Slide 27?
I think it is the slide before with the equation.
26. Yeah, here we go.
Okay. So given this formulation, what economic interpretation would you like to have for this in terms of incentive that a market participant would have with managing the resource?
Yep. So the idea is, and this is the idea that's sort of outlined in those academic papers that we've been talking about, but basically as your cycle depth gets bigger or as your state of charge gets further away from your maximum state of charge, the resource incurs more costs. And those costs are related to the cell degradation and eventual cell replacement that would be needed as the metal inside of the storage cells degrades. And that's sort of the principle of what we're trying to express here in this equation.
So in other words, what you're saying is that below a certain level, it will be cost prohibitive for the resource to operate.
That's exactly right, yeah.
And it therefore means that in light of the framework that is typically used for market power mitigation, that is like the reverse logic, so to speak.
Well,
because basically you usually think of when you hold less capacity, yes, it is going to be priced at a higher value, but at the same time, within the market mitigation framework, you would like to have more capacity being made available at the representative price for that capacity. So it's nearly like what Alva had said earlier. One has to be careful with a framework that you don't embed some sort of practice to exercise market power.
Yes, I agree with that.
So this is exactly why in SE's previous comments about this framework, we were very concerned about the structure. So I hope that you would give it consideration going forward and revise what you have.
Yeah. Okay. I think we'd be interested in thinking about other frameworks that you think would be more appropriate.
Okay. We will reflect those in our comments.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you, Beverly. I always appreciate your comments.
Sure.
Operator, do we have another call on the line?
We have no further questions at this time.
Great. Well, the good news is that was the bulk of what I wanted to talk about. That we still have a few more slides here, so I will continue to run through those. I think we're on, if we go to the next slide here, we're on slide 28 now. Basically, thinking about the model in this way, we sort of outlined, you know, there are some potential pitfalls, and I think one of them, and this might have to do with the entire framework that we've been thinking about, may have to do with Beverly and Alva's comments that they've had. So that might actually be an item that we'll include in the con column. But essentially, we've outlined, you know, why we might like to use a model like this. And essentially, we do want to capture the fact that greater cycle depth incurs greater costs, and we think that this model does do that. Of course, there could be other implications, as we've just talked about. So we'll continue to be cognizant of that and think about what implications that might have. You know, with that sort of nesting principle that we've talked about earlier for cycle depth costs, this model doesn't necessarily encompass that like the rainflow model would. This model would sort of be an upper bound on what those costs for cycle depth would be. So we would think we would always cover a resources cost, or the idea would be that this model would always cover a resources cost, but there may be times when the resource is just charged and is not at full charge that the cost may be lower than this model predicts for a resource to operate. But we think this could be workable for many storage resources on our system. And then, as we've noted here several times, market outcomes could tend to charge the battery because of how prices work. So the cons is, and I just mentioned this, but this model may overestimate the cost for a resource to produce. During some times, this always is assuming that the cost for the resource to operate is at its maximum cycle depth. We don't incorporate the nested charge and discharge cycles, and we don't use a rainflow model here, so we can't incorporate sort of every little change that happens with the resource. We're just sort of estimating at the maximum level. However, with the current prices in the system, where we generally see lowest prices during, certain times of the day, certain hours of the day, and highest prices during other times of the day, and those hours tend to be contiguous, we would expect that by and large the resource would be charging during contiguous hours and discharging during contiguous hours, in which case this model might not be or do such a bad job. So that's sort of where we are here. So if we go on to the next slide, we've also outlined this in our paper, and I know there's been a couple questions about how we've derived this equation, and I just don't think, unfortunately, we're trying to get to lunch here at noon, and I don't think we're going to have enough time to go through this in great detail, but we have thought about other ways we could potentially model this, and it could just be based on state of charge during this interval versus state of charge in the last interval, or essentially what the second line of this equation says, that we could model cycle depth simply based on dispatch instruction. So if we dispatch the resource more, it incurs a higher cost. If we dispatch it less, it incurs a lower cost as long as it's discharging. So if we go to the next slide, this sort of outlines that same chart that we showed before, where we've got this hypothetical 24-megawatt resource with 100 megawatt hours of energy storage. If it's charged at full 100%, and the resource or the market optimization is thinking about where it can be dispatched. It can be dispatched anywhere from 0 megawatts up to 24 megawatts of discharge. 12 megawatts, a 12-megawatt dispatch instruction would be equivalent to 1% of cycle depth. In this case, we've labeled the value of rho such that we get $10 if the resource was dispatched at 12 megawatts, and then $20 if the dispatch was dispatched at 24 megawatts. Unlike the previous model, this one, the costs don't change from interval to interval with state of charge. The costs remain the same, so at T plus X, again, if you're going to dispatch the resource at 24 megawatts, that cost would be an additional $10 for a cycle depth, and then if you're dispatched at 24 megawatts, $20. So you'll notice that the curves here are identical whether you're at 100% state of charge, 40% state of charge, or any other state of charge when you're dispatching the resource. So this is an alternate derivation for cycle depth that we've thought about. So if we go on to the next page, we sort of outline that, hey, look, there's pros and cons to this model as well. We may be able to get rho such that the resource is efficiently dispatched. Of course, we know that it's not going to be changing. So there could be times when this model overestimates costs when cycle depth is particularly low, or it could potentially underestimate costs when cycle depth is deep. So we want to be mindful of that and just think about that if we do decide to go down a road like this. And then there's also some unintended consequences here where round-trip efficiencies may be understated as well, which is something I think we talk about in the paper. But if we go on to the next slide, I'm just going to, again, I know we're going to try to get you guys out of here at noon to take a little break because we've had a lot of material, but I do want to get through these next few slides. Opportunity costs, this is our model on how we want to develop opportunity costs. But essentially, if you've got a resource with a storage duration of delta, so small Greek letter delta there, so for example, most of the resources that are on the system today are 4-hour resources. So the way we would calculate opportunity costs would be opportunity costs for 4 hours during the maximum 4 hours for the resource, and we'd use the maximum 4 hours for the previous day, which is the OC T-1 figure here, and we multiply that by the day-ahead bilateral index for tomorrow relative to the day-ahead bilateral index for today, and we pick the maximum of that value, that ratio, or 1. The idea here is that if we anticipate, so the day-ahead bilateral prices, which we'd assign a relevant bilateral index to each location, so likely these would be something like NP15 for resources located in the northern part of California, SP15 for resources in the southern part of California, and then we think about resources outside of California as well. But we might have something like NP15 prices for the day-ahead market. For tomorrow's prices are expected to be, let's just say, $25, and then day-ahead prices for today's market that were posted yesterday were maybe only $20. So in that case, we'd take a multiplier and multiply the opportunity costs or the highest 4 hours from today's market, and we multiply that by 25 divided by 20. So we basically scale those prices up based on expected higher day-ahead prices tomorrow based on the bilateral prices. So it's a little bit complicated on how we're doing that. It is somewhat similar to how we're doing some of the calculations for the hydro default energy bid, so we're borrowing some information there. What is my next slide, Jimmy? So let's just take a pause here and see if I have any questions on opportunity costs or on that other derivation for cycle depth costs. Operator?
We do have a question that just came in. Caller, your line is now muted. Go ahead.
Hey, Gabe, this is Adam Swadley from DMM. Just a quick question for you. What's the thinking behind only applying the scaling with the bilateral prices when there is an increase from the prior day versus changing expectations, if prices were to decrease on the following day? So you can have pretty significant changes from day to day, and it seems like you might overshoot quite a bit if you don't consider the downward direction also.
Yeah, Adam, I think that's a valid concern. One of the things that we were thinking about is, well, there's a potential that, the storage resource actually purchases energy in the market today for sale tomorrow. So you might actually be buying energy during the lowest prices of the previous day. And that's sort of where we came up with our formulation for the energy derivation, which is similar to the opportunity cost derivation. So we've sort of used the same derivation for this, but I agree. This may scale things up when one day is particularly high compared to another day. So I think we'd encourage feedback on how to think about that as we move forward with this proposal.
Okay, and so I guess kind of a follow-up question to that then, and maybe this is one just for stakeholders more generally, but how realistic is it to assume that there's charges being held, over a day or multiple days? Because it seems like at some point there would actually be an opportunity cost to holding that charged energy. If you're start to get to the point where you could forego, maybe more profitable price spreads just because you happen to already be charged and you haven't realized a price that's, as high as that you charged.
Yeah, I would be very reluctant to start thinking about maybe like holding these things over like a change of a month or a season or something like that. I just don't think that that's the kind of arbitrage that these resources have in mind. I do think it's possible that a resource is, sees particularly low prices one day and says, oh, hey, this seems like a good opportunity to charge, and maybe waits for a day with particularly high prices or relatively high prices, maybe like the next day or the day after or something like that. That seems a little bit more reasonable to me.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wasn't meaning to imply that it should be any longer, maybe even than one day. And that was kind of my question, I guess, in general. What's the understanding of how long it is reasonable to expect that the resources may hold a charge before you ultimately get to the point to say, okay, I'm holding this charge and I'm foregoing additional opportunities to cycle the resource?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Adam. I don't have a terrific answer for you. I think we might see that borne out in some of the math with the current resources that we have on the system. And with that said, we do see some resources holding a state of charge overnight. But I think maybe this is to your point, maybe, this wouldn't be optimal to do over multiple days.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I appreciate that. Operator, any other questions?
There are no further questions on the line.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll continue to push on here then, and I fully understand that there's a lot of stuff going on in these slides. So as we mentioned, and I appreciate the questions on these as well, there would be a variety of parameters that would need to be submitted to master file. This would include round-trip efficiency values, which I think, as Beverly noted, these are values that are already submitted to the ISO today. But knowing that these go into calculations would probably be a good time to just verify and make sure that round-trip efficiencies are up to date. Storage duration would also be something that would be captured by the ISO. Again, this is something that likely, or actually the ISO already calculates, but just verifying that these values match up with resource owners' expectations would be worthwhile. But by and large, as we mentioned, a lot of the resources, for example, if you're a resource that has a Pmin and Pmax of -2 megawatts and a Pmax of +2 megawatts, most of the resources on our system are 4-hour duration batteries. So that would be a 8 megawatt-hour battery, and a lot of that information is currently what's captured in master file. So we do have those, but we continue calculating those, and we would be using that information in our default energy bid calculations. And then we'd also be collecting the cell degradation costs, and this is sort of the big one that we need to start getting. Obviously, this would be different depending on which discharge cost model was ultimately implemented by the ISO. This is a hard number to nail down to, because I might have a certain expectation for how frequently my resource might run, and with that expectation, I may need to do cell replacement at a certain date. As we likely all know on this call, cost of cell replacement is decreasing, so sort of every year you put off cell replacement may be potential cost savings that you enjoy. So thinking about what those cost savings are and thinking about expected replacement dates may actually be impactful to the value of row that you use to calculate cell degradation costs. And then, of course, we would expect that this value would be different per facility, vendor, market participant. All these things could have different expectations and different models. However, on that same note, if there are a lot of very similar resources in the system, you might anticipate that the same vendor for a battery might have similar costs. So that might be something that we look to synergize as we collected this value for multiple resources. And of course, we also intend, we're not planning to blindly implement something here. We want to look at values that are collected across the industry as we're developing our default energy bids to continue to do sort of, maybe sanity checks or something, if you want to call them that, to make sure that the numbers that we actually see being calculated by our models are reflective of costs that we see across the industry and in sort of the literature that's out there today. So if we go on to the next slide, I think we're about done here. So other concerns that have been raised about storage resources to this initiative, if default energy bids are adopted, resources would potentially have the ability to bid in at those values or need that ability to bid in at those values that match the default energy bids. So again, part of what we're planning in this initiative is not just this ability to have a default energy bid that varies with state of charge, but to have a bidding structure that would also vary with state of charge. Now, we realize that our market's not set up to handle those today, but again, we've been talking with our development folks here internally, and I think that this is something that could actually be implemented. So it's something that we're considering as part of this initiative to really, and again, this is to allow resources to have flexibility to bid their true costs into the market, and the idea would be that you'd capture a lot of the benefits of being able to bid in the market. So we're looking to do that. the ISO is balancing the needs to derive a default energy bid that does not underestimate costs with the need to mitigate for market power. And I think Adam was sort of getting into some of these questions. We want to make sure that the resources or the default energy bid is sufficiently high so that these resources feel like they can participate in the market and they're not going to be dispatched at prices because of mitigation that are actually below their true variable costs. And we want to be very sensitive to that. But we also want to be sensitive to the fact that these resources could potentially exercise market power. And if they do exercise market power, they could potentially escalate prices for all of the resources in the fleet, particularly as we move to a system where there could be a lot of batteries on the system and those batteries could be marginal. We want to make sure that any kind of default energy bid that could be applied during intervals of market power mitigation are relevant and accurate to true costs to what we think it actually is relevant to operate a storage resource at. So we're trying to balance those two things with this initiative, so this is sort of more of the high level. And then finally, we just want to always note that resources, just because we implement a specific default energy bid for battery resources, it doesn't necessarily mean that all battery resources have to have this default energy bid. There's always a default energy bid that can be negotiated with the ISO. This is something that a lot of the resources on the system have today. If you have a battery that's got a unique operating characteristics, this might be an avenue that you want to pursue. There's other things. There's also, the variable cost default energy bid, which is a standard default energy bid that's offered to the tariff that's available and availed by most gas resources. The ISO is currently contemplating in another stakeholder initiative values for variable and operations maintenance. And the idea there would be that these values could potentially flow into variable cost default energy bids, and those might be appropriate and high enough for some storage resources. So the point being here is that there are other alternatives out there for storage resources, and it's not just this particular default energy bid, although we would like to have this default energy bid accommodate as many resources as possible so that it can be used and, again, represent those marginal costs for resources. So with that, I'll pause one more time and take any questions before we take a break for lunch.
Thanks, Gabe. As a reminder, folks, please push #2 if you'd like to enter the queue.
We have no questions at this time.
All right. Thanks so much. We will reconvene here at 1 p.m. Pacific time for the afternoon portion. And appreciate your attendance, and to be continued.